Renaissance spans a period roughly 1300 to 1600 AD, seen as a glorious age of civilization and embodied to a large degree in Florence in northern Italy. The Renaissance saw, well, the word itself means rebirth, a rebirth of interest in classical learning, an interest in antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome. But the Renaissance also saw a fostering of secular values, enjoyment of the here and now, worldly things in a very overt way in society. And as we'll see as the program progresses, individualism was an important value. In fact, individualism was celebrated during the Renaissance to a degree not really seen since ancient days. Really, the ancient Greeks celebrated individual achievement, and that spirit really was renewed during the Renaissance. In fact, what it features is virtually every ancient philosopher known at the time of Raphael. He painted this around 1500. And not only philosophers represented here, but scientists, mathematicians, all of whom were considered philosophers, people who had a love of wisdom, a love of learning. And of course, the architecture suggests classical Greek architecture. And what's especially important, now I pulled this image out of a smaller view here on the fresco. Very famously here, dead center in this panoply of characters is Plato on the left. Actually looks a little bit like Leonardo da Vinci, a little artistic liberty there. Plato is pointing up to the heavens. He fostered the idea of an ideal world somewhere beyond this realm, actually influenced early Christian theology as well. So here's Plato, the idealist, and apologize for that, something keeps coming down. On the right here is Aristotle, depicted in this famous fresco. He's got his hands kind of pointing or gesturing towards the ground. Aristotle was the empiricist of the ancient Greek world, wanted to study the real world, human phenomenon, rather than speculating on abstract notions of truth and beauty. So again, an interesting homage to the ancient world. And my final point about this painting is it's located in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. And that reinforces the notion that Renaissance art, although it celebrated the human form, human life, society as it's lived, at the same time, artists and philosophers did not deny the spiritual realm. Still very much a Christian world, but what we see is a new dimension added to Christian faith, an interest in human potential, human God-given potential in this new world of the Renaissance. So one caveat as we get started here, I asked the question, who is Renaissance? The reason I asked that, well, two reasons actually. First off, the Renaissance was largely an intellectual and then an aesthetic phenomenon. The idea of the Renaissance was invented during the Renaissance. The word appeared for the first time. And the idea is that it represents a new age to separate society from the Middle Ages or Dark Ages, they were sometimes referred to, an era, time of primitive conditions, superstition. A writer in Florence, in fact, wrote in 1430, and it reflects kind of the pride and the hubris that you see in Renaissance thought too. He wrote, "Now may every thoughtful spirit thank God that it has been permitted to him to be born in this new age." Yeehaw! So they certainly thought they were onto something hot during the Renaissance. So again, primarily an intellectual phenomenon. And also, the reason I have the image of the painting here is that the Renaissance had very little impact on society at large. The masses of people in Europe and in the West toil away in obscurity, subsistence, existence. As you can see, these workers here, they're working on a palace. In fact, that's the title of the painting. Painting is from the 16th century. They're not experiencing any Renaissance. Their life just goes on. And in fact, 100 years after this painting, the philosopher Thomas Hobbes wrote, that the state of humanity is largely nasty, brutish, and short. So no Renaissance 100 years later, and no Renaissance really, if you think of what defines the medieval world, for example, things like serfdom and endemic disease, uncontrollable disease, violence, warfare. You can see a lot of medieval conditions persisted up into the 19th century and even into our own time. So there are aspects of the medieval still around us nowadays. So let's not get too cocky about considering ourselves Renaissance men and women. But having said all that, Renaissance is still worth studying for the great art and architecture. We'll begin here in Florence with an illustration from 1493 of Florence itself. And you'll especially note up here the Duomo, the cathedral. This is the Arno River, along which Florence was established. Like a lot of cities in Europe, Florence was originally a Roman garrison town. The Arno was navigable to the sea. The countryside around Florence, very important for natural resources, agricultural resources, livestock, and so on. And Florence at this time was a typically northern Italian city-state, self-governing. These city-states had papal charters allowing them to be governed autonomously. They were free from oversight by the king and the church, and they're very, very competitive rivals amongst each other in northern Italy, and that accounts for the city walls there, the defensive walls, which really stood around Florence until the 1860s, and also accounts for all the towers you see, not only along the battlements, but the towers in the city itself, to keep an eye on who might be coming over the horizon, whether it be a rival city-state or perhaps imperial troops from the Holy Roman Emperor, some other outside power, France, Spain. So remember too, as we look at the Renaissance, this was a very violent time in Europe. A lot of great art, but a lot of violence and less than ideal conditions for most people. Now, by the 14th century, at the dawn of the Renaissance, Florence was one of the leading economic centers in the world, population of about 100,000 people. And although the Florentines referred to their state as a republic, it was really more of an oligarchy. A small group of elite ruled the city, and politics was really dominated by a variety of merchant and professional guilds, sort of like early unions or trade associations. And a key to the prosperity of Florence was the wool industry. This painting from the Renaissance shows some of the 26 steps involved in making wool. Wool was a natural resource for Florence to develop. You have lots of sheep in the hills around Florence. You have a large immigrant workforce, and you have the Arno River for washing and dyeing cloth. And so the cloth manufactured in Florence sold all over Europe, even into the Middle East and China. This is a Renaissance picture of an Italian tailor shop. And if you go to places in northern Italy like Milan and Florence, you'll find still fashion, fabric, very important in the economic life of the area. Now, to finance all that economic activity, you need banking. The word bank originates from the Italian word banca, which refers to the counter on which money changers plied their trade. Florentine bankers responsible for a number of innovations, commercial innovations, double entry bookkeeping, which I never understood, but they did back then. Checks developed in Florence, and the currency in Florence, the florin, was the first international currency. Long before the euro and the dollar, the florin was recognized all over the known world, really. The most famous banking house in Florence was the Medici family, founded by Giovanni de' Medici, there on the right, in 1397. And the Medici went on to become a great commercial dynasty in Italy and had their tentacles in the papacy as well. 4 popes came out of the Medici clan, including Pope Clement VII, who famously denied an annulment to Henry VIII, sparking the Protestant breakaway in England. Now, all of the economic activity, of course, generates a great deal of wealth, which is enjoyed in the upper strata of society. Here's a painting by a Florentine artist, Botticelli, entitled Wedding Feast. Now, it's a little bit exaggerated. I think the architecture is a bit extreme there, but it suggests the wealth and good times available if you're in the upper levels of Florentine society. This wealth, by the way, proves to be very important for the Renaissance. The wealthy bankers and merchants of Florence were the first collectors of art, private collectors of art. So no longer are simply princes and prelates of the church commissioning art, buying art. Now private citizens do the same. Why? They're interested in surrounding themselves with beautiful things to show off their wealth. They enjoy being in the company of creative types. And a lot of these characteristics, I think, are typical of wealthy people today, wealthy philanthropists. They want to enhance their own status by having wonderful, beautiful surroundings, very luxurious art included. And also there's a patriotic element here too, because the Florentine elite were very, very proud of their city. They wanted to help glorify the city. And one way you do that is to endow or support great works of public art that would be available for everybody to see, both art and architecture, statuary, and so on. So all of this wealth is percolating about, providing kind of a material base for the Renaissance. As Florence becomes increasingly sophisticated, increasingly developed, country homes, villas become very popular for the elite. The one on the left there is a typical site of summer recreation during the heat of the summer out in Florence. And within the city itself, within Florence, palaces like the one on the right were designed and built by, in many cases, famous architects. Michelangelo himself designed and decorated some of the palaces in Florence. And Michelangelo wrote about living generally. He said, "A splendid residence is the source of much honor, being more conspicuous than mere possessions alone, and bears witness to our noble birth." So there again, you see kind of a civic motive as well as a personal motive in living in a very high style in Florence and in the surrounding countryside during the Renaissance. But despite the refined living of Florence, there was an undercurrent of political scheming, outright violence. When Florentines were not fighting off invading armies or rival city-states, they were fighting each other. A good example of this is Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, shown on the left. He was the grandson of Cosimo de' Medici, the founder of the Medici Bank. By his time, after 2 generations, less interested in banking, more interested in patronizing the arts, writing poetry, running around with beautiful young maidens, living the high life generally. But also, Lorenzo was the uncrowned tyrant of Florence, a ruthless individual, de facto ruler of the city through bribery, threats, extortion. The Medici never had any official, until quite late, they never had any official position in the government, but they were the power behind the ruling elite, able to use their money, their power, their influence to reward their friends and punish their enemies. A good example of this came in 1478 when a rival banking family, the Pazzi family, tried to kill Lorenzo at Mass in the cathedral itself. Well, Lorenzo's brother was killed, but Lorenzo survived his wounds, and he goes on to lead a vendetta against the ringleaders in the Pazzi family. He hangs them, as well as the Archbishop of Florence, who had the misfortune to get involved in this campaign. He hangs them all from this windows of City Hall to great acclaim from the public below. And on the right is a drawing of one of the Pazzi. That may be, I don't know if that's the Archbishop himself. He looks like he's wearing clerical garb, hung by Lorenzo's mob. And the drawing, you might recognize the style. It was actually drawn by Leonardo da Vinci, who was in the city at that time. Here's another character who falls into this turbulent atmosphere. He looks kind of weak there, weak jaw, not very impressive looking guy, but that of course is Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote the famous political treatise, The Prince. He was not a fan of the Medici. He actually served for a time as an official in the government of the Republic of Florence. There was a time, about 15 years or so, when the Medici were out of power in Florence, and he served in the government at that time. When the Medici came roaring back into power, Machiavelli was arrested, tortured, and sent into exile. And he wrote The Prince, shown there on the right in an early English translation. He wrote it in order to get a job with the Medici. And so he offered his views on very practical statecraft, very ruthless, amoral, stresses the need for the ruler or the prince to do whatever is necessary to preserve the safety and security of himself and his citizens. One of his famous quotes from the book is, "It is better to be feared than loved, but avoid," I'm looking at my notes here, "but avoid being hated." So he advised, or purportedly advised, rulers on how to walk a fine line between tyranny and submission to the popular will. So very influential book. Didn't do much for him. He never got the job he was after. And the book was actually not published until after he died. But again, certainly influential in political theory since then, and gave rise to the word Machiavellian, which is sometimes used to describe somebody who is willing to succeed politically at all cost, letting the end justify the means. So we're about to segue into the realm of art. I know you're all interested in that, perhaps more so than politics. But let me first talk just briefly about this notion of humanism. This was a very prominent pattern of thought during the Renaissance. Literally, humanism began as an educational movement. It was the idea of studying human condition, the human condition, holding that this life is not simply a way station between birth and salvation, but life is something of meaning and value in and of itself. And the humanists did not reject religious faith, but they believed that mankind could realize his God-given potential in this world. Humanism was based on study of the classics, Greek and Roman literature. The founder of humanism is often considered to be the poet and philosopher Petrarch, shown toiling away in his study there on the left. Grew up near Florence in the early 1300s, and in the course of his studies, he came across a number of ancient Latin texts in a library. And this helps explain why the Renaissance occurred in Italy and not anywhere else, because the ancient learning was preserved, to the extent that it was preserved, in the neighborhood of cities like Florence. So he discovered these works and saw in ancient literature a way to make people a better Christian. He saw important ethical values that were worth propagating, and fostered the idea of active citizenship. That was part of being a humanist, was to be involved in your government, sacrificing for the common good. There's Roman values, very important. And it appealed to the pride of Florentines. They could be active in this world to improve their own lives, to improve the life of their community. On the right is a painting of, there's Lorenzo himself, Lorenzo the Magnificent. He, like any number of other wealthy Florentines, developed private academies, learning sites for the young sons of merchants and noblemen. Actually modeled his after Plato's academy. And so humanism involves education influenced by the development of the printing press. So learning is no longer confined to the cloister or the monastery. Learning can spread widely among the upper levels of society, and they can use that education to enhance their own lives, enhance the life of their community. The notion of humanism, of course, and Renaissance values generally epitomized in Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance man. I think the term was invented to apply to him. And he's shown there to sort of, as an emblem of his study, this drawing called Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius was a Roman architect back in the day. And so Da Vinci is portraying this human form as something worthy of objective scientific study, and also pointing out these classic proportions of the human body. So a very different look at humanity from Leonardo da Vinci. Interestingly, Leonardo had no formal artistic training. He was an illegitimate son of a minor official born near Florence, and learned about the human body through direct observation, including dissection of purloined corpses. Dissection was forbidden by the church as desecration of the body, but he was able to obtain clandestine bodies. He would go to the public baths and sketch the naked bathers for his artistic edification. He only painted about 20 paintings that we know of. One of them, I think the only one in the Western Hemisphere, I could be wrong about that, but down in Washington, D.C. at the National Gallery is his painting of Ginevra da Benci. If you want to, when the quarantine lifts, if you're just dying to see a Da Vinci. But he was also a sculptor, architect, a writer, scientist, engineer, inventor, a restless, solitary genius, again, characterizing the notion of a Renaissance man. He was patronized by the Medici family, received their financial support. Then he migrated further north to Milan, where he became a servant, so to speak, or under the patronage of the Sforza family in Milan, and ended up in France, where reportedly he died in the arms of the king. A worthy end for this great Renaissance master. So now we're going to move directly to art, and you'll see how these humanistic values are reflected in the transition from medieval art to Renaissance art. And I'm going to take a break from talking here shortly and let a couple of experts talk. I have, and hopefully I can get it to work here, a wonderful 1990 documentary, a PBS documentary featuring Bill Moyers. Some of you will remember him from those wonderful shows of the past. And I have two excerpts here talking about what's inside these two buildings. The one on the left is the Baptistry of St. John. It's part of the Duomo, or the cathedral complex at Florence. And on the right is a rather nondescript church, the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine, and we'll be looking at some frescoes in a chapel inside the church, the Brancacci Chapel. And both of these video clips will really present a good reference, a frame of reference for talking about this transition. And I also want to point out, listen carefully to the folks being interviewed. The dialect is a little bit hard to follow sometimes, so you'll have to pretend you're in Italy and you're asking for directions to the train station, and you'll be able to understand them. And also you'll notice both of these video clips begin with music, which I think is very appropriate to the theme of the respective segments. So I'm going to go through some gyrations here and try to bring up the first look at, in this case, the medieval world.
The rediscovery of those human values at the heart of the Renaissance didn't happen overnight. It evolved slowly out of another way of seeing and feeling, out of another world, the world of the Middle Ages. One of the few buildings in Florence that survived from that time is the baptistry. To gaze up at the mosaics on its ceiling is to enter the mind of the Middle Ages. And angels, terrifying scenes of heaven and hell.
Yes, all this is the Middle Ages in its great glory. There is an entire Christological cycle depicted here, and also there are scenes from the life of Saint John the Baptist, to whom this building is dedicated.
Why has this building been so revered by the Florentines?
All the Florentines were baptized here. Even Dante was baptized here.
You're a Florentine. Were you baptized here?
Yes, I was lucky and honored to be baptized here. And so my son Lorenzo was also lucky and had the privilege of being baptized here 7 years ago. Now, unfortunately, this building doesn't serve its original function any further.
Piero Morselli has long taught the history of the art of his native city to students who come to Florence from Syracuse University. And what do you see of the themes of the Middle Ages here?
Well, we have, first of all, this large, monumental image of Christ, who is overpowering all the other images surrounding him. Is Christ the judge? He is the most important thing. Not the man, but Christ the God. This is typical of the Middle Ages.
Look at the feet.
Unarticulated.
Yes.
Unrealistic. The face is standardized according to the style of the time. It is fixed, frontally depicted, flat, without any kind of a volumetric image, you see.
Nothing of the real anatomy.
Exactly, it doesn't count. What it counts is the message that it conveys by its great giant, by its gesturing, and by those great burning eyes. He's judging. You see the hands. Look at the left arm and the left hand. He's negating, he's pushing away, he's condemning all those souls of the damned who are being devoured by Satan and by those diabolic creatures. Side, he is uprising the souls of the blessed, of the good, and he's welcoming them to his world.
And we know almost nothing about the artists who worked on this project.
Absolutely nothing. The artist didn't count. It was only hands at the service of the church. We are nothing. We just have to accept this message.
Sorry for the delay there. I hope you can, whoops. Oh, come back. Hold on, folks. There we go. So just a refresher on what we saw about the Middle Ages. We see the fixed hierarchy of saints, Christ as God, Christ as judge, not as man, a very stern message in this mosaic. And being a mosaic, it's very stylized. There's no need to be realistic. And we don't know who created this work. The artist or the artisan is anonymous. Only the message is important. This is very much a medieval worldview and a medieval aesthetic understanding. So now we're going to go to the Brancacci Chapel here, and let me gear up for our second video clip.
While Donatello inspired Florence with sculpture animated by human emotions, another artist of blazing originality was transforming painting. He too was attempting a new grasp of reality, showing human beings as they were on the streets of the city. Inside the Church of Santa Maria del Carmine is a small chapel named after the Brancacci, the Italian family that commissioned the frescoes decorating its walls. These frescoes are today perhaps the most important in all of Florence. For centuries, they were covered with dirt and soot, their original shapes and colors hidden from us. Now, the restorer's genius has lifted away the layers of grime and the fig leaves added by an artist of a later, more prudish time. The man who painted these frescoes died before his 28th birthday. His name was Masaccio.
One could speak about these frescoes for weeks. Incredible how many people studied this cycle. It was a sort of textbook for the 15th and early 16th century. Then,
Federico Zeri is one of the world's leading authorities on Italian painting. He has taught at Columbia and Harvard and is the author of dozens of books and catalogs for museum collections throughout the world.
What are these stories telling us here?
They are telling about St. Peter. I like very much this one with St. Peter healing poor people with his shadow, walking through the streets. What is extraordinary is the dignity of the walk of St. Peter. You feel that he is walking as someone supernatural. You feel that man is seeing as something dignified. There is a sort of deep respect for the human mind in these frescoes. And then I find it amazing that before 1428, someone should have painted that cripple, for instance. That is something that must have been often seen in the streets of Florence. Then there is an old beggar, almost naked. Masaccio is a man who had seen with open eyes Florence, the inhabitants, the problems of Florence, the society. This is what I admire in Masaccio, and this is why I find him so extraordinary. He doesn't try to hide. Usually painters try to hide. They hide an ugly face, they make it beautiful. Think of the thousands and thousands of portraits painted in Italy during the 16th century. Very seldom you find an ugly face.
We take it for granted today because it's been around so long, but this reality, this discovery of reality was new and radical for that time.
Yes, very radical. It is a sort of break with what we call the medieval world and the medieval culture. Complete, total break. In Masaccio,
So you can see, and we'll explore this a little bit further in just a minute, how different this fresco, here it is, St. Peter healing the sick with his shadow by the artist Masaccio. And just to reiterate some of the points that Professor Zeri made, people here are depicted as they really are, life as it is. I love the background. That's a street in Florence. And the characters in the painting are undoubtedly modeled after real Florentines. But notice the technique, very naturalistic, use of light and shadow. The people have shape, they have volume, they're located in space. And again, the point that Professor Zeri makes, there's a human dignity in their depiction. So it's a religious theme, certainly, but it reflects a new view of humanity, human life in this existence. So to really bring this home to you, and I'm not an art expert or an art historian by any stretch, but I was able to find these three examples of a very typical artistic subject in Western art. The Virgin Mary, the Madonna and Child. And going from left to right, these really highlight this transition from a medieval worldview to the Renaissance. The one on the far left is he's really not considered part of the Renaissance, more a late Byzantine artist. Cimabue lived in the middle 1200s. And you'll see his depiction of Mary is very flat, stylized, no expression, an idealized setting. But a century later, with Masaccio, again, this is Masaccio, whose frescoes we saw in the video clip, painting in 1426, his Madonna has realism, psychological and physical realism to it. This particular painting is sometimes referred to as the tickling Madonna. The baby is laughing. You know, it's still a sacred theme, but there's a humanity to it. Very natural lighting. Mary is expressive, looking at the baby Jesus, the way she's turned away from us. In about a century after this, a Florentine by the name of Giorgio Vasari wrote the first book of art history. And in it, he said about Masaccio, the works made before his day can be said to be painted, while his are living, real, and natural. So a near contemporary endorsement of this new way of looking and depicting the world and even religious subjects. And on the far right, 80 years later, we are now in the High Renaissance with Raphael's Madonna. Just look at the difference in how she's depicted. Note, first of all, that the color scheme is the same, those the iconic red and blue that is associated with the Madonna. But she's got a lifelike face, very stylish hairstyle, rosy cheeks, very approachable, friendly. And she's located in a very believable scene. That could be a real town in the background, a real landscape. And although it's still a reverent painting, there's a touch of emotion, even a little bit of playfulness here in the way Jesus and his young friend down there, an angel, I guess, just playing like a mother and her child would play. And to really point up this distinction, I've blown up the Cimabue on the left and the Raphael on the right. And nothing to me could more starkly demonstrate this difference in artistic conception between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And I want to point out here, if you can see, the halo is so prominent on Cimabue's Madonna. Here, just the faintest hint. I'm going around, there's just a hint of a line drawn around her. So she is, again, she is the mother of God, but she is also a beautiful young woman, as depicted by Raphael. Here's some evolution you can see in the world of sculpture. Florence liked the story of David, the giant killer, David and Goliath. They loved that story because Florence, in the international or regional power politics of the day, often saw itself as an underdog. So Florence liked to think of itself as kind of a cultural, a political David. On the left is Donatello's take on David from 1340. This was the first freestanding nude statue in 1,000 years. And you can see it's idealized, somewhat cool, somewhat androgynous. This was luxury art for a private purpose. It was commissioned by the Medici family for use within their own palace in Florence. 1504, fast forward a century and a half, there's David. Very different look to David, a very different purpose. This is public art. It was commissioned by the city officials of Florence, originally going to be in the Duomo, in the cathedral. It was later on moved right outside City Hall, where it, you can see it today. It's a copy outside now, but originally proudly outside City Hall, a symbol of civic pride, patriotism. Quoting Vasari again, the art historian, he wrote at the time, or a century or so afterwards, he said, "This statue was intended as a symbol of liberty for the palace, signifying that just as David had protected his people and governed them justly, so whoever ruled Florence should vigorously defend the city and govern it with justice." So a very political statement in this massive sculpture by Michelangelo. In fact, it is massive, 16 feet tall. It was the largest statue in the world at the time. And David is heroic, poised for action. Michelangelo himself put forth a heroic effort to carve this statue. He worked on it for 18 months after this huge block of marble sat for 60 years. No one else could find the underlying beauty of the stone, bring it into reality like Michelangelo. Michelangelo himself is another interesting Renaissance personality from Florence, a temperamental genius, the greatest artist of his time. He was the first artist to have a biography written of him while he was still alive. He attended the Platonic Academy run by Lorenzo de' Medici. He left Florence and was invited to Rome, where he worked for the Pope, creating, among other things, the creation of Adam there in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. In his time, Michelangelo was called Il Divino, the Divine One. Can you imagine an artist, a craftsman, working for the papacy who is nicknamed the Divine One? Seems almost heretical. But now painters are not just no longer anonymous, they are now celebrated as cultural heroes. Michelangelo, by the way, stayed in Rome for a while. He eventually returned to Florence at his death, and he's buried in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, like many other famous Florentines in history. Well, in the 16th century and later, Florence enters a kind of a twilight period in terms of cultural excellence. Florence becomes a part of the Holy Roman Empire in the 16th century, semi-autonomous, ruled by an individual now with the title of the Grand Duke of Tuscany. But the economy of Florence weakens. Dutch and English competitors take over much of the trade in cloth and other luxury goods. Mediterranean trade declines. The banks lose their influence with the church, lose their influence in politics. And there's less money available to support art, and so the wealthy citizens of Florence tend to spend money more and more on just extravaganzas, self-serving entertainments, like what's shown here on the left. It may not be obvious. This is a pageant of a sea battle recreated in the Medici Palace in Florence for entertainment. So money is going to support these kinds of self-serving frivolities, less so towards great public art, certainly. And the rule of the Medici, now they've been demoted to Grand Dukes. Well, sounds pretty important, but they really were under the thumb of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the last Grand Duke of Florence was John Gastone de' Medici, the last Medici Grand Duke. You can see he doesn't look like a very model of an effective ruler there. He actually ruled Florence from bed, accompanied by both male and female companions. And after his death in 1737, the Habsburgs take over, rule Florence directly, followed by Napoleon briefly, and then Florence in the 19th century is just absorbed into the United Kingdom of Italy. So as Florence declines politically, fortunately, the legacy of Florence still lives on to the enjoyment of tourists like you and I. The art created for the Medici stays in Florence. The last surviving Medici, the sister of the Grand Duke, in her will, she bequeathed all of their family art to the state of Tuscany. And so much of it is found, well, all of it's found in Florence, much of it in the Uffizi Gallery, shown here, the Uffizi Gallery. The name derives from the fact that it was a former office building in Florence, a government building, repurposed as an art gallery. Also, you can find Medici art and lots of other great art in the Pitti Palace, the Medici family palace there, down in the bottom as depicted in 1565. And it's surrounded by the Boboli Gardens, also on my list of places to visit across the river from the main urban center of Florence. The Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge built in 1565 to connect the city hall, the Palazzo Vecchio, on the left in the center of the city with the Boboli Palace up on the hill, or the Boboli Gardens and the Pitti Palace on the right up on the hill, appropriately illuminated with golden lights because the bridge was used for goldsmiths and silversmiths when it was first built. And I think that's still, if you're looking for some really high-priced souvenirs, you'll find them in those shops along the Ponte Vecchio. Fortunately, the bridge was spared during World War II as the German troops were retreating from Florence, being pushed out by the Allies coming up from the south. All of the bridges in Florence were blown up, but this particular bridge was spared, thankfully, and you can wander across it today. And as I said, spend a few dollars or euros in the process. My last image from of the world of art from Florence is the tomb of Lorenzo II. Lorenzo II was the grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent. His tomb was designed by Michelangelo, created by Michelangelo, and it shows there not him, but allegorical figures of dawn and dusk, a very classical take on how one should be memorialized. And this is located in the Medici Chapel, where else in the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence. And there is Lorenzo himself in life on the right. So a closing quote in the realm of art is from Alexandre Dumas, the French writer of 19th century. He said, "Let the Medici rest in peace in their marble tombs, for they have done more than any king or prince or emperor for the glory of the world. And as you remember your trip to Florence, or this virtual trip to Florence, or when you hopefully plan a trip to Florence sometime in the future, that'll become clear to you as you wander the streets and the galleries of this fabulous center of the Renaissance. I want to close here, since we're in Florence. Let's just go on the outskirts of this city and pay homage to the 75th anniversary of VE Day, the end of World War II. Outside the city of Florence is the Florence American Cemetery. This is one of 24 American cemeteries, war cemeteries in Europe, honoring the dead of World War I and World War II. Of course, the one in Normandy is most famous, but all of these cemeteries are real inspiring places to visit. I highly recommend that you visit one or more of them, especially one of the out-of-the-way cemeteries next time you're in France or Belgium or Luxembourg.